the last question on discussion, and so this is going to be what's it called, simple CSV. And so yeah, so just as an overview, if you haven't read it or done it already, um, essentially CSV stands for comma separated values, and if we had to input like first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, eighth, and then it would be able to parse it out into like each line. So for example, this result actually is not correct. It only represents like the last line, but you can imagine it does the same thing for the first, but this would be like the grammar for BNF. It would go from lines, going to one line, and then going to individual words. In this case, one word, the first word's fourth, then fifth, then sixth, and then notice how there's like two commas right here that represents like a blank cell in like a CSV. And then so it's going to point to word, but word's not going to have anything. And then finally, the last word is eighth. And then if you imagine, it doesn't really have it here, but we would have another line for first, second, third, and then that line would point to like three words with pointing to like first, then second, then third. But yeah, and so that's what's it's gonna be. And so one thing to note is that words, like the things that can be in between these commas, they're only gonna be the letters from A to Z, only letters, and so that's kind of convenient for us. Or they could be blank, as once again, like that comma right here. There's like a blank cell right there. And so yeah, and so let's go into this code right here. And so one thing to note is that actually just take a second, look through BNF, and I'll like point some things out that we might want to take note of. And so yeah, so one thing to take note of is that words have already been handled for us. And so comma.word, that represents like any word, for example, like fourth, fifth, sixth, eighth. And then what we notice here is we created a symbol. It's already been given to us, word, and it points to word question mark. So word is like the thing that we just imported down below. And so that means that word can either represent nothing or it could represent like a word like sixth. And so that's already been handled for all of us for this problem. And so the word pointing to fourth, the word representing nothing, that's already been handled for us. And all we need to do now is like put the words into the line and put the line into the lines. And so here we define lines and line, and as you can expect, they kind of do what we expect it to represent. And so line would represent like fourth, fifth, sixth, eighth, that's one line. And then lines would like compile all of these lines together. So the first row, the first line, the second line, and then that would be like the representation. And so yeah, let's take a minute, a few minutes, however long it takes for you. Think about how we could represent line. I would recommend starting out with line first and then lines after. And then so one thing to note is that they're like comma separated. So we went over this in discussion, but think about how you can represent comma separated values, and then we'll go over it together afterwards. All right, sounds good. And so let's get started. And so let's start off with like the line part. And so for the line, one thing to note is that we have like fourth, then comma, then a word, another word, comma, another word, comma, etc. And so the way we want to represent like comma separated values, went over this in discussion. This is like a pretty often used format for BNF. So please remember this if you haven't already. But one thing to note is that if we have one word, then if we had like just the word fourth, then there are no commas, right? But for every subsequent word that we have, then we're gonna have like comma fifth, comma sixth, comma blank. But remember that blank is also a word, and so comma word, and then comma another word. And so how we're going to represent this is that for a line, we're like pretty much guaranteed to always have one value, right? So we could throw word right here. So we're going to start off with a word, but for every subsequent value, like subsequent word, then we have to have like comma word, right? And so we're going to have comma word right here. And so if you imagine, we could put like comma word, etc. But the thing to note about this is that we can have like an infinite number of words. We can have like 2 words, we can have like 5 words, 10. We can't really tell. And so that's why we have to use like a quantifier. And so these comma words, they can happen like 0 times in the case there's only one word, or they could happen like some arbitrary amount of times. And so to quantify that, we're going to use like the star quantifier. And so we're going to wrap it around in parentheses to represent like grouping them together. And we're going to throw a star right here. And then so it's essentially saying that we first have to have like a word in a line. And afterwards, we can have some other words. It could be like 0 or more words. But these other words have to have a comma before it to like separate these values. And so that is what line is going to represent. And then what's going to happen afterwards? Actually, no, we're done with the line actually. And so the thing to know about this is that the reasoning why I put like the parentheses right here is to say that apply this quantifier onto both the comma and the word. So if I just had it like this, then it would be the equivalent of saying word, comma, word, word, word. But we want like the commas in between it. We want to apply that star quantifier onto the comma as well. So we're going to group the comma and the word together and throw the star in. Yeah, so that's the reasoning why we do that. And then so, yeah. And then so moving on to actually, let's test it out real quick. And then so if I were to run this in a terminal, I'm going to say the start begins with a line because we want to just test a line. But let's say we put like 4th, 5th, comma, 8th, something like that. And then so yeah, so as you can see, line points to the word. The first word's 4th, the second word's 5th. Then we have a blank word because, there's a blank right here. And then we have 8. And so it works as expected, which is pretty nice. And so yeah, moving on to lines. And so lines goes in like a pretty similar fashion. And so I think, I guess it doesn't say here. But with like lines, there's but in between each line, there's gonna be like a new line character. So it's gonna be / like escape n. That represents a new line. And in pretty similar format to before. Word is like word for a line is like word, comma, etc. For lines, it's gonna be like line, new line, new line, then etc. And then so we're gonna go in a pretty similar fashion. So the first line always has to be there. But then afterwards, we're gonna have for every like subsequent line, we're gonna have to have a new line, then the line. And we can have like 1 or more, like 0 or more additional lines. So we're gonna throw a star right there. And then so yeah, and then if we were to run this code, I'm gonna play it, so it loads it in, and I throw like begin, and I can say line 1 is gonna be 1st, 2nd, 3rd, line 2 is gonna be 4th, comma, 5th, comma, 6th, and then so if you were to type those inputs in, what would happen? I think it messed up a little actually. Yeah, so it actually kind of goofed up. I'm not sure why it did that. Let's see. Okay. Oh yeah, okay, I know why. And so, yeah, and so what happens here is that we go like line, and then word, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and then the second line is going to point to 4th, 5th, 6th, and then last but not least, there seems to be a bit of an issue right here where we have like a 3rd imaginary line that points to like an empty word. And then so one thing to note about like file inputs is that sometimes we can have like a new line at the end of our code and all of that. And so to address this issue, what we're going to do is that like at the end of all of our lines, we can have a new line or we can not have a new line. So I'm going to throw in like a new line right here. And then this new line can be like optional. So we could have a new line or we could not. And so the reason why this like final line appeared is because essentially there's like a new line input or like another space. And then what happened was that the BNF said we have to match that. So it interpreted it as like a new line and it went into like a blank word because there's nothing there except a new line. But yeah, and so if we were to run this once again, dot begin, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, comma, 6th, what happens here is that we end up getting as we want. So the first line points to first, second, third, and the second line points to fifth and sixth with a blank word in between because we have like the comma right here. And we run the doc test, everything seems to work. Awesome. But yeah, and so once again, please remember this format right here. So if you have like comma separated values, new line separated values, or like some delimiter separated values, or like you have to put one in between everything, this is like pretty much the structure that you just need to know. And so keep that in mind. Word, like whatever value that you have, then your separator, then another value, then group those together and throw like a star quantifier in there to say, yeah, you can have like one or more of them. And yeah, so that's gonna be, what's this problem name? Simple CSV. And if you have any questions, once again, please like let me know and I'd be happy to answer. Yeah, hope you have a great day or morning. It's not 2:38. All right, good night then.